So good evening. My name is Shanora. I'm the Design Lounge Coordinator for the APDL here at the State Library. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Turrbal people and the Yagara people, and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. I'd like to welcome you tonight to our lecture with Bijoy Jain from Studio Mumbai in partnership with the UQ. Before we start, may I please remind everyone to switch off their mobile phones and to use the back exit if you wish to leave during the talk. Bathrooms are located on levels 2 and 3. We are also recording tonight's lecture for the State Library Queensland website. If you have any concerns about that, please let one of the library staff know. There will be time for questions at the end. Please wait for a microphone to come around to you. If you prefer to ask a question via Twitter, use the hashtag APDLLecture. I would like to now welcome Anupama Kundu, who will be introducing tonight's speaker.
Hello, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to have the opportunity to welcome Bijoy Jain, whom I know really well since 2000, before he shot to fame and visited me in my house. I remember he gave me this complete works of Picasso, and we had really interesting conversations. We were both in our pioneering days, I would say, and it's great because I've followed up his career, but I've never heard him talk at a presentation. I've just read in journals and so on, and I'm familiar with a lot of people who've, talked and discussed his work. So I decided to save time on his bio. Everybody knows about him. It's been a very packed session today. So I'd just like to say that, not only is the connection for me with the name, Mumbai Studio, since I come from Mumbai, it's a very amazing thing to see what he's achieved, and I would like to just sort of summarize that Bijoy is someone who if I dare to say this, somebody I really respect for the fact that he doesn't compromise. I don't know if this is true or not, but that's the impression that, one gets. And I think he has somehow reinvented, at least in not only in the Indian context, I think in general, the role of the architect, and he's stretched the envelope to include much broader areas of innovation and creativity, and I'm really looking forward to what he's going to present. So please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Thank you, Anupama. Actually, we go back much later than 2000. We actually started architecture school in the early 1980s in 1983. She was in a different school, both in Mumbai, and we share a lot of common friends. I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time, and coming here. Thank the University of Queensland and also Luis Feducci, the convener. Let me just quickly sort of dive into the slides, set this up. What I actually want to share with you is more my own personal journey. So oftentimes I do discuss in the studio that don't think as an architect or practice life as an idea of what we actually do. And so on this whole idea of what does it mean to practice, or what does it mean to practice anything, whether it's music, architecture, poetry, mathematics, economics, and what's involved in that process of practice. So I think if you quickly read that, and it's also an evolution that took place. It wasn't a manifesto, it wasn't an agenda that was sort of prescribed or delineated. And oftentimes I'm asked also just, that it must be easy now that you've been in this method of practice. And actually doesn't get easier, it actually gets harder every single day. And every single day you have to sort of, in a way, not reinvent, but reconfigure, put everything back in balance. It's sort of this idea of the body itself. And if you go through your entire day, the next day you have to sort of reboot and reconfigure yourself, and you don't actually go back into what you were yesterday. So in a sense, the practice or the nature of practice or the nature of architecture and the way we practice is really based on this idea of engaging the body, mind, and spirit. Very quickly, I want to just share with you that I come from a country where we have 1,200,000,000 people. And again, it has a sort of long history of, architecture. And if I just want to put things in perspective, that more than half the population of this country actually builds its own architecture. That is, I'm being very conservative here and saying 500 million people actually practice their own architecture, which is outside of what hopefully you and I do, which is the professional idea of practice. And somewhere in the midst of all of this, I think it has been my interest. I was educated for some time in Mumbai, but again in the modern idiom or the modern sort of philosophy or ideology, and then went on to study in the US and then practiced in the US, or actually did my apprentice in the US, then went back, practiced in London for some time. And somewhere in the midst of all of this, there was a sort of curiosity or a sort of murmuring inside of, wanting to go back. Not for anything else, but it somehow felt more comfortable or sort of more, don't want to say the word natural, but sort of more intuitive. You sort of sense the scent or the touch or the tactility. And I said, let me sort of look at this idea of looking back at this sensibility or sense that one has inside. Again, India's, we know it's economic boom, there's a sort of fast development, things are changing at a rapid pace. And somewhere in the midst of all of that, my interest also actually lies in this idea that is there a possibility that these, so to speak, cultures, if you call it, one that is in tradition and then one that is in modernity, actually is there potential where they possibly overlap as opposed to, in the way that we normally think that they're actually diverging or moving away from each other. So again, just, that's Mumbai there, and that's, I call them, oftentimes these are referred to slums, and for me, I think it's more the idea of settlement because there's a sense of family, grandparents, washing, bathing, the regular rituals that, one encounters on a day-to-day basis. So these are just sort of, images that sort of create the atmosphere of the place or the land that I practice in. Again, this idea of water, more than 500 million people actually go to a source of water, unlike, you turn the tap on and water comes to you. So this idea of relationship to water, it could be a local water tank, a local well, a religious tank. But this sense of developing an idea of ritual, and in that process, developing a relationship, there's a familiarity, if I'd like to say. Sorry, how do I get this? So and the one on the top, the image on the top is actually in Mumbai. It's one of the last spaces or places left in Mumbai where you still have this water tank. And it sort of emerges from the ground, much like an artesian well. So again, just these different relationships. Also culturally and socially, we still fundamentally are a pagan culture. We still practice that idea of a relationship to earth, ground, trees, water. And if you look at, the really sort of the larger populace, we really, there's Shiva, and so there's this practice of, the male and female organs that, that are actually celebrated, and that's what we practice. So just more as an understanding of what does it mean to negotiate something in this kind of culture where things are not necessarily so clearly delineated or prescribed. Again, then we have, at least on the western coastline, and again on the eastern coastline, basically two seasons if you look at it. There's the summer and the winter, which are quite similar, and then the sort of very heavy monsoon. And again, the interest was to explore, moving to a smaller place, which was Alibag, where our studio is set up. It's actually the mainland of the country, and Bombay is the island. Was more also to get familiar with a culture that is primarily agrarian. We're an agrarian culture, depend heavily on the monsoon. I've grown up basically in an urban landscape, whether it be Mumbai, Los Angeles, or London, or St. Louis. And somehow to return back, to really get a sense of what does it mean to negotiate and practice in a place where I'm not actually, I've lost my familiarity, so to speak. And just the other day, talking to friends, we've been exploring certain ideas of the relationship to sky. And just something that I want to throw, just put out there, this idea of living in cities, and maybe not here, I don't know about Queensland more specifically, but this nature of sky, that there's actually text or writing written in this idea of the stars that we see up, be it the Egyptians, the Peruvians, the Indians, and there's a whole sort of language that's written there. And how, being in urban conditions where light itself, electricity itself, in some way causes a schism in that sort of very fundamental relationship like we'd have with the ground, water, earth, et cetera, but also this idea of a relationship to the sky. And again, I'm kind of slightly deviating from the context of what I'm talking about, but it's, again, in that whole idiom of what does it mean to practice in a sort of holistic way where we consider all these elements that are constantly in flux. This particular slide I like. This was taken a few years ago, and things are changing, and it's 100 years of history that in a very compressed period of time, in the last 25 years, things are rapidly changing. And so the slide on the left is really a place where a motorcycle has come in, and I like this idea of this overlap, that which one came first. And what's interesting, again, here is that the motorcycle or the scooter is actually brought into the living room as a prized possession. It's sort of celebrated. And how the staircase that was once there and this ramp that's now been overlaid. And what I like about this particular picture is that there is a lack of distinction of which one actually came first. So the sense of loss of time, or what we normally call timeless, what does it mean to be timeless? And I think somewhere it's this idea of consideration where both parties or both situations are collectively or universally considered in the way that they can potentially come together. Not so much joined, but the way they would come together, and they can remain separate, but at the same time be collective. Again, this particular slide is actually a stone in Hampi, and I just took it out of curiosity of just this idea of a suture, these sort of markings that are on this stone. And much later on, I discovered actually that this is how they would split stone, with very simple devices. These holes were made, and then wooden pegs are sort of driven in, and then actually water is poured, which enables the wood to expand, and then that's how it splits the stone. But I like the idea of the ambiguity of what does it mean, or some sense of a latent potential where this can be reclaimed or rediscovered. And just again, more importantly, going back to this idea that, it's not so much I've reinvented, but I think to relook or reclaim, the practice of architecture. I think that's, for me, more important, this idea of, what does it mean to really practice as an architect? Again, interestingly, in India, this idea of there's great ambiguity, when you say, and if you've been and or experienced Indians, which I'm sure you have, where yes and no is the same thing. You say, are you saying yes? And you'll get this nod of the head, and you say, is that a yes and a no? And it might be a no. And then you say, is it no? And they'll say, no, it's a no, yes and no, and yes and no. And it sort of goes on there, and then sort of the head gets faster or slower, and it's this gesture. So I like this idea of, the ambiguity of gesture, this idea of not being specific to a yes or not to a no, that there's a sort of reading in between. And it's in that ambiguity, I think, that what I actually quite enjoy. Again, as a population, when you think, with 200 million people, if we had a system, so to speak, in place, which is very precise, if you said come at 6:30, it's impossible that the lecture would start at 6:30. It would be definitely 7:30, possibly 8. But it's important, because if we have that sort of, I don't want to call it a discipline, but a system that is so regulated, it would be impossible for negotiations to occur, and these chance moments. It's every day, every moment, it's all about negotiation. And so hence I like this idea of a yes and a no. You can ask a question on a Monday and say, we do it like this, and you'd sort of get sort of a strange answer, like with a very sulky face. No, it cannot be done. And then you come back 3 days later and ask the same question, and it's the manner in which you ask the question. And then sort of looks up at you and says, why did you not ask me this question earlier? And I'm saying, excuse me, it was exactly the same question. No, but that's the way you said it then, and the way you say it now is different. So it's always, everything is in the nuance. And so what I'd like to share with you in this particular slide is, for me, it was, traveling in Rajasthan, which is the northwest part of India, above, borders Pakistan and the sort of Indus. But these pitchforks that are actually used for farming and their evolution in terms of a perfect representation of really the extension of the hand. And if you look at this particular image on the left, the leather that sort of wraps around holding the fingers or the sort of, what do you call them, the fork. This idea of also the suture, the way the leather is sutured. But again, it's intuitive. It's not been intentional. But this idea of observation, looking at how our hand functions and then developing this mechanism or this armature. So my curiosity was really looking at that, and we stopped the car, and just by accident, this gentleman on the right, I stopped and I picked up his pitchforks, in a whole bunch of different people selling. And it's kind of interesting that, you drive by and you'll see 15 of these guys, all collectively selling exactly the same thing. But more importantly, so I go up to him and, talking to him, and I said, I'm picking these up. And then I look at him and I say, how come you're the only guy out here dressed in this yellow T-shirt? All your friends are dressed in this sort of old, in the traditional linen shirt. And he says, well, I get it for free. So I said, well, can't argue that. And then I sort of go back, some more conversation continues, and then I ask him, but then who'd give it to you for free? And he says, these companies that are, advertising, whether it's Coca-Cola or plywood or whatever, there's all this industries that are now coming, and they give these T-shirts out for free. And so he says, and I said, you can't argue that too. It's cotton. It makes sense. He gets it for free, and why not? And so then we exchange money actually at some point in time. And the next thing he sort of dives into his T-shirt. And I look at there's sort of this pocket, because all this time he was sort of crowd sitting, so I couldn't really get a sense of that. I said, wow, how did you do that? And he says, what's the big deal? I took it home, took it to my wife. She cut it up and stitched this pink satin pocket. And I call him, the pocket man. I think for me what's interesting in this particular slide is the lack of prejudice, I think more importantly, where this idea of a juggernaut, an economic juggernaut, that is fast sort of taking space, so to speak. And this idea of where space is being constricted in this idea of economy, where there's a negotiation, but that one that is not prejudiced, in the sort of seamlessness and how that is embraced and sort of taken in, and where the possibility of both can exist, much like that staircase and the ramp. And so for me, this was sort of really interesting, this idea of motivation of, where do we design from, or what motivates us to design, or how do we design? And so I think this slide for me is seminal in the sense of what it actually communicates and the possibility that we have, and hence again this idea of the potential overlap. This was interesting. This happened early last year, and this photograph was brought to me. He's a master lime mason, a friend of mine, in his 60s, Swiss, crazy, immaculate at his work, and he was traveling in Rajasthan because I'd invited him. I said, you should check out how lime, because it dates back a few thousand years, and there's one place, in a sense, to look at it, based on what he was doing. So anyway, he comes back from his trip and puts this photograph on the table and says, Bijoy, guess what this is? And he's kind of tearing this out. He says, no way you can, there's no way. And I sort of look at it, and 10 minutes go by, and half an hour goes by, I says, forget it, I can't guess what this is. So he tells me what this image is and what it's about. So I say, okay, Rudy, let's test this, So we go back to the studio. And again, I didn't introduce that. Our studio, basically, it started with a few architects, myself and a couple, Samuel, who actually lost his way from America. Normally we go to America, but he came to India, and I don't know why, but he's still there. And most of the rest of the studio is really based, are practitioners, but who practice the art or the making of things. And again, this idea of making is not so much just, you give them an instruction and they make. They're actually involved in the development, on a conceptual idea of air, volume, weight, light, mass, emotion. We can talk about these kinds of things, and then based on that, they would basically respond much in the same way that you saw Pocket Man respond, or the guys with the stairs, that it's inherent, it's intuitive. And so somewhere I discovered that, because right in the beginning when I came back from the US, and I started making a whole bunch of working drawings and and all of that stuff. It just sat on the table on the job site and just collected dust. And all I really knew was actually giving instructions directly, having conversations, storytelling, that idea of the gesture. And it sort of occurred to me at that point in time that, I was constantly being hung, after every project, because you knew that a project could be realized in a particular way, but somehow it never met that. And I always found myself in trouble, with the clients. And you know how it is, laws and these long drafted papers. And I said, hang on, this doesn't work really. This is not making sense. And so let's just cut out all this stuff in between. And I'll take responsibility for everything. I'd much rather be hung making my mistake than being hung on somebody else's mistake. So that's actually the way the practice really started, was this, taking ownership for one's actions, so to speak. But again, coming back to this image, I know it deviated, but coming back to, so I say, okay, let's take it to the studio. And I take it to the studio, and the first guy is this character called Jivaram, who's actually my main guy. He's sort of shaman, head carpenter, about 35 years old now. Been with me for about, I think, 14 years. And something that's inherent in them. So anyway, I show him, put the photograph down, and I say, can you guess what this is? He kind of looks at it and says, no, I've not seen this before. And I said, well, I'll give you a clue. This is in your state. This is where you come from. But further south, where it's there's a little bit more water in Udaipur. And then he kind of looks at it and sort of looks back at me, in a minute goes by, and he says, yeah, ye to jhaad hai pakshi ko baithne ke liye, which translates into, this is a tree for birds to sit on. I'm like, how the hell did this guy get it? So I said, Rudy, no, this is probably an accident here. Let's take it to the next guy. And so we take it to the next guy, Purnaram, and he basically looks at it and says, something to do with fishing maybe, or, He says, no, not that. And about 30 seconds go by this time, and they haven't actually heard each other. And he says exactly the same thing. Ye to jhaad hai pakshi ko baithne ke liye. This is a tree for birds to sit on. And it's phenomenal because there's no connection to this object. And I think the operative word here, or the operative sentence, is that this is a tree for birds to sit on. It's not a tree. It's a tree for birds to sit on. And this idea of a relationship that is nurtured or developed from which this object, that has a certain economy of means, an optimum measured approach in the way that, a bamboo that is taken is split in half, opened up, and this idea of this armature that simulates the nature of the tree. And of course, there are very beautiful birds in this area in Udaipur, where in the evening you actually ascend to the terrace and you sit on these beds. They're called charpais, like four-legged sort of beds with these beautiful cotton woven sort of like a mesh, purely because it's hot, and you sort of sit there and you actually have the opportunity to lie and actually enjoy the birds that come in the evening because it cools down. And so they actually simulate trees because it's very dry and it's quite difficult. But just this idea of what motivates the object, where does aesthetic lie, where does this come from? And so it's not so prescribed. So anyway, I just thought I'd share this with you because somewhere it's been a discovery for me too, this idea of, a loss of aesthetic, more importantly from one that is numerical, and this idea of aesthetic, one that comes from an emotion, but also tied back to this idea of the scientific, where actually all of these are connected, sort of body, hand, and mind. Again, this is our studio. The studio is more like a traditional atelier, maybe that existed in India at some point, I'm certain, or in Western Europe, or in the Americas, where what we call human rapid prototyping, where you think of something, and then we can quickly make it, look at it, and you feed back onto it. Or you actually make something from which you then make a drawing. So this is, again, just a very quick sort of showing you just an environment where we make mock-ups, material tests. Again, more so to confirm the intentionality of, I think, every move, every strike, so to speak, that you make, because every action that you take, you become responsible for that. So often things are done and then tested, and through that testing and through the observation, we're able to sort of come up or make deductions of, the possibility of its ability to endure, if I might say so. Again, these are sort of working drawings, and that's the gentleman up there is that the guy I was talking about earlier, the shaman Jivaram, where we take these, they draw in their sketchbooks. I normally carry a red pen, this micro ink Japanese pen that I actually picked up from mimicking my professor way back in the US. And it's interesting that everybody has a red pen in the studio, all the guys. And it's great sort of the way things, this idea of mimicking. And I'm sure you should try it out if you haven't already. You come, you can be at a bus stop, a train station, whatever, boat stop, or just hanging out in the garden, and you could be drawing there, and before you know, you'll have sort of a crowd gathered around you, and they'll sort of all sort of huddle up around you and start peering into what you're drawing. And you kind of look back at them, and then everyone will kind of step away, complete strangers, Take a pause and you start drawing again, and this time you continue to draw. And you sort of they'll all sort of slowly gather, and possibly some more might join the crowd. And then next thing you know, they'll start getting into a conversation. Oh, you forgot to draw this. And what about that? And it's great, I think. Yes, somewhere it sort of takes into this idea of privacy. But then again, what is private and public space? It's such a fine line. I mean, when you also look at our own selves and this idea of this line in between, an imaginary taut line of between private and public, and that how fine that negotiation really is. So I kind of like that idea that this was something that I did. I used to make small axonometric drawings just as a way to communicate. So these are actually documents of communication, much like a working drawing. It is our working drawing. And these were sort of started way back, where they'd make all these, not necessarily correct or precise, but then how does it matter? Because what's being expressed in them really holds the atmosphere, or holds the material, or holds the intuition. And also there's a certain precision. Again, what we did was develop models, making a full-scale mock-up. I just want to see, how does the laser work? Is there someone who can... Anyway, okay. So this photograph down on the left is a full-scale mock-up. And what we discovered, I had a few students, young students from different parts, and they were still drawing in the studio, and we were still trying to figure out the section. And I said, okay, let's run a test. And so I made a quick sketch, we discussed it, it's like sort of elephant standing on, that big elephant, and these blind men standing, trying to figure it out. And before you know it, this thing was produced in 2 days, more economically than making those drawings, and that didn't even work. And what's nice about these things, so I call them armatures, these manifolds that are made. What's good about these is it allows for collective communication between myself, the people involved in building it, strangers, friends, architects, clients, that actually everybody can gather together in a collective dialogue or participation. And that's what I mean by collective dialogue, is to somewhere that you cannot ignore the physical presence. It has a presence, and one has to, in some way, acknowledge its presence, even in the fact that you might remain silent, that you cannot not acknowledge its existence. And so this idea of making these things, from a small scale all the way up to a full scale. And normally what we do have is we actually have many scales and many different methodologies of practice, ongoing at the same time. Much like an equalizer, when you're making music, that you have treble and bass, and certain things are, more developed and certain things are not, and at some point you find a sort of optimum balance. But again, these are sort of objects or sort of instruments of representation that actually tell stories, And that's really how we sort of developed this nature of practice. It was just as a way to communicate, more as a means of communication. I'm running very slow, but I'll try and speed up. Again, then, just this idea of tools, and again, what I think more importantly, and that's why I said we're not practicing architecture, but this idea of truly being able to express oneself. And so what is it, that things can be actually, in the way that one expresses, can be limitless. There is no delineation or sort of boundaries, that we can say, oh, because of that particular industry, I can't do this, and because of this, I can't do that. And so somehow to explore this idea of what does it mean to work in an environment that is limitless, but also that requires a certain economy, and this idea of that limitation, so to speak, of economy, of not moving that much to be able to produce things. So again, a lot of these things that I'm showing you here are just these different, it's common, it's not that, but we also make our own tools. We make our own details based on the tools that we make. I particularly like this slide, and I call this slide Postures in Architecture, and this was during the Venice Biennale in 2010. We were there and we had to make this sort of black cement screeded floor, this oxide that was impregnated. And we were 8 carpenters, Sam, myself, and we were setting up our space. And there was this Italian contractor, local set of guys, and they said, I said, can you do this for us? Because none of us were masons, really. And he says, well, not quite, but we can get it out of a can. It's kind of like that. And we said, no, that's not the same thing. And somewhere in the midst of all of that, we discovered that, we've looked at our masons working on something like this. And he said, okay, let's just break it down. If you've seen Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev, so much that you hunch it, you sort of anticipate, by what you have seen. So this whole idea of posture, and so we said, okay, well, let's do it ourselves. And so what it meant also was we had to sit on our haunches, sort of go down like that. So the 8 carpenters get down on the floor and start working, and then Sam gets down, and he can just about barely sort of make it flat on his feet, and gets up in 2 minutes. I didn't even attempt to go down. But what's important in this is that, the possibility that our methods of making, is it possible that they disappear, not so much because of a lack of material, not because of a lack of know-how, but the possibility that to take a posture in a particular way, in the way you make it, is what slowly disappears. And so this idea of what we are calling tradition, or the lack of tradition, is possibly embedded in just the postures that we take. And again, for me, importantly, this is the kind of posture that, it's more the space in between of what's being made and the maker itself, that space that is formed. And it could even be in the form of, I think you call them backhoes, or these JCBs, which are these big machines. And really, it's not about, I'm not nostalgic about tradition, history, craft, absolutely not. But it's more using this and watching this to understand how we can negotiate these other things that in some way have speed and a sense of power that is built into it. And how do we negotiate that? Because here, of course, we talk about human scale, but I don't think that these machines or these objects of making are actually inhuman. It's what we bring to that ourselves that possibly takes it into that category. So it's all about, again, negotiating that idea of distance and space, or the space that's actually in between. So again, just a question putting out there, what if postures in architecture disappear? Do methods of making go out along with that? I'm going to run through a few slides very quickly, because we've started making models that actually, where there's an ambiguity of scale, in the sense that this is a project that we're actually doing. And we actually now, what we're trying to do is transfer the material that is being built into the model. So the model sort of takes its own autonomous life. It can be put out in the rain, it can be tested for weather, but it's an object by itself that is independent of the real thing. And in a sense, this loss of location or loss of scale, where both the real and the model are interchangeable, that which one is real and which one is not. This idea of, imagination and reality, that they're both interchangeable. So again, these are just models that we did for a show in Japan that actually simulated the landscape. And these are all done in our studio. What we discover all the time is the ability to transfer a skill, be it a carpenter, a mason, a stone cutter, that they're able to negotiate and move between territories. It's not sort of that they're stuck just doing woodwork or stonework, that they're able to move between these different practices. And it's more about the attitude or the skill that they bring with it. Or I think more importantly, the understanding of the nature of environment, which they're very attuned to. So one of sort of an early project, we discovered this sort of cut in the ground, a hole in the ground, which actually had sweet water. And going back to one of the earlier slides, where we actually have to go to the source of water. You don't get it in a tap. And of course, this is slightly on the outskirts. It's more a retreat for a family of 3 generations. And we found this sort of cut in the ground. And that became the basis of actually the project, because it had sweet water. We could depend on it. And this is our consultant, the gentleman in the hat. At that time, he was about 78, had sort of met with a sort of very serious accident at the age of 20, actually digging a well. But he was a master well builder. And you can see sort of through the gestures, that's him up again on the left. And what's interesting is that at the age of 20, he actually fell, much like some of these youngsters who are working, and then spent or dedicated the rest of his life actually mastering something that nearly took his life, and his sense for the ability to gauge, the depth of water, this idea of the invisible. How do you develop this intuitive sense of knowing how much water, where the presence of water is? And that was his real skill, this idea of, and so we used a consultant like that to negotiate this cut in the ground, like the idea of a belly button. So the entire project really stems or sort of evolves or emanates from this idea of the cut of the ground, in which there's water that's held. And again, this idea of a liquid foundation. So I liken this space to the idea of a belly button, and the whole gesture of the house is really protecting the belly button. It sort of embraces or sort of forms this protective ring, if you want to call it, or an embrace around the source of water. And that's again in the monsoon. It's a space, basically this particular structure, so to speak, is what nourishes the house, nourishes the family, the plants, and et cetera, et cetera. So in a sense, it really is in the sense the true foundation of the house, or the foundation of the space. And for me, again, this idea of a nature of ruin, or the nature of time, where things change, programs change, functions change, but what must remain is the sense of center, the sense of core, that is fundamental to the value of that place. So in time, let's say if the house in some point would decay, what would still remain is this sort of very central core from which again something new could re-emerge. So in a sense, finding the presence of this idea of core that exists, I think, in all of us, that exists or is embodied in everything, in land, in spaces, and what better place like here in Australia, where you have an entire culture that has embedded its entire sort of origins on the basis of place and core and location. So I'm just sharing this idea of, for me, this is really the project. And this again is taken in the summer, in which I soon discovered, because you can see the water line, and that was taken a couple of hours later. And what we found was it actually registered the tide, registered the time. Again, India as this idea of time, we work on 2 time zones, the idea of Greenwich Mean Time, which we all know, and then this idea of moon time. And hence we have a lot of holidays, we're perpetually having holidays, But it's quite interesting, there's a sense of ebb and flow, which is really based on the moon. And come the monsoons, you can do whatever you want, you could pay X amount of money. There's nothing that can stop people from actually returning back to places that they come from, because there's a constant migration or movement of people. But come the monsoon, and you sort of see this sort of space where they go back to their origins, fix their spaces, cultivate the fields, and it's very much an integral part of the culture. And I soon realized that the idea of the loss of one of the senses, because this is not more than about 30 meters from the sea, maybe, give and take 50 meters at best. But the presence of the sea was more evident, because oftentimes as architects and as humans, I think a lot of times we actually depend on our eyes, and I think in some ways it limits, what one senses. And so here, in a sense, just the registration of this watermark and this movement of the tide really heightened the sense of the presence of the sea. Even the sound that was that filled the space had this idea of, if you've ever held a conch shell to your ear, this sort of reverberation of the sea. And that was this idea of discovery that actually, outside is inside. We keep talking about inside and outside and outside and inside. But for me, it was the first time that I discovered, it wasn't intentional, but this idea of the discovery of what does it really mean to be, outside while you're inside, and that the two can actually come together and merge as one singular experience. So that's the plan, and you can see, I don't know if you can see very clearly, but up there in the center there's these holes. Actually, these are sort of air holes or weep holes that allow the rain to enter and the air to go through and the heat that is filtered into the space. So again, this whole idea of that idea of this gesture and the water that comes off the roof in the monsoon sort of recharges or goes back to the aquifer. So in time, what you're collectively doing through the process of time is just nourishing this one central source, and everything sort of really works towards sort of nourishing that one fundamental source that would actually allow it to endure time itself. This is a project. How am I doing on time? I'm okay, yeah. This is a project up in the mountains. This was for a client that actually ran a travel he's sort of like, how do I say, he does these very private tours and wanted to take people up in the Himalayas, where you'd go on these treks and sort of explore, quite far. I mean, this is at 8.5 or 8,500 something feet, which is about 2,000 odd meters above sea level. And another project that I did for him, both by accident, and he had these sort of tents from the desert that were sent up there, and he had this idea of this colonial past that we'd actually pitch tents as we go along, and you can't really do that. I mean, 200 million people, you can't start pitching tents anywhere and everywhere. It's not possible to do that. So anyway, this land that he leased and acquired, and it's always been for me an interest in this idea, because we have a very rich tradition in a sense of building. And you go to the northeast, you can go to the west, the northwest, you go to the south, and huge changes in climatic conditions, materials. I mean, we have so many different languages. I can move from one state to the other, and we speak a complete different language, clothes, the way we look, what we eat. And so there's a great diversity. And this idea of, to tapping into this diversity just purely from a curiosity of, what are the possibilities? There's already an infrastructure that has evolved in time. So anyway, this is a traveler's lodge, if you want to call it, a small retreat. It has 4 rooms and a central lodge which has a living dining kitchen. The land was leased for the farmers for 10 years, and the farmers gave a very specific condition that, whatever had to be built, there was no concrete, nothing fixed or permanent could remain. And the land had to be handed back exactly the way that we had acquired it, and that they would be still enabled to continue with their farming and their culture. And I thought that was great, that we were able to sort of have these conditions put on us. So again, that's the mode of transport. You sort of take a train from Delhi, and it's an 8-hour drive up into the mountains, and then it's a 2-hour walk to the site. So all the measure, so to speak, was based on what a human could carry. So the dimensions of the glass, the timber, and the stone. And of course, the stone was very local, because that's what they built in, was this dry stack masonry. And again, it's seasonal, because men and women both are engaged. They're primarily farmers. And they tend to their crop in the summertime. Then come the monsoon, where the fields and these terraces along these mountains are what are cultivated. And then in the wintertime is when they work. And that's sort of like a system of barter, if you call it, where they exchange their, not knowledge, but their skills. I don't know, I don't have the right word right now, but there's this inter-participation, of a sense of making place and maintenance and all these things that go with it. So anyway, these are sort of women, and the materials kind of harvested only 500 meters away from the site. Can we dim the lights down a little bit, please? Thank you. So this was actually, we did 4 recce's, so to speak. We went 4 times, to really understand the sense of proportion and the idea of their construction. That's Samuel Barclay, man who lost his way from the US. But you can see the proximity of the harvesting of the material, and this idea of measure, optimum, and locale, if you want to call it, local. And so that's really what we did, was just understand this, had a dialogue, discussed, and then through that idea, we actually practiced in our studio, different methods, because the budget was tight. We couldn't really do a contour survey, so we did our own sort of higgledy-piggledy contour survey, which was as accurate as it could be. But just this idea of stance and nuance of what was the important dimensions, or what are the important spaces that one needs to know in the nature or the topography of the land. And again, I use the word topography very carefully, because it's not just the physical topography, but the intuitive topography of the land. So anyway, just very quickly, that's the different seasons, and the whole idea behind the project was really to build these sort of retaining walls, much like you would actually see locally, to sort of hold back and create these terraces for plantation of the fields, and then actually piggybacking on these retaining walls. So the structure that is wood frame and glass, actually comes from the plains. The wood does come from that region, and that was made at a studio and then actually shipped or brought to the site and assembled. And again, with the idea that it can be disassembled or dismantled in time to come, once the lease expires. And again, here, there's no, I don't want to get into this idea of electricity and water and blah, blah, blah. It's fairly fundamental, straightforward. And the idea of the proportion of the room, where the rooms were, so to speak, engineered based on local knowledge, on the local understanding or the familiarity of how far they could actually stretch a material. And that whole idea of negotiation of, what was the distance that we could cover, and to sort of, in a sense, respect that, and consider that, I think from both sides became very important in this sense of establishing this idea of boundary, of dimension. And very much, in a sense, familiar with how they live. Of course, they spend most of their time farming during the day, so when they go back, the last thing they want to be doing is looking at the landscape from the inside. They want to be secured, insular, and protected. So that's the difference, and that's the idea of the overlapping of cultures. While we're going there more as spectators or observers of a landscape, not much involved in the working or the everyday working of the place. But yet there can be a mutual participation that can occur through experience. And that's the slide that I particularly like, because that's how I imagine, this idea of sense of time, the resonance of time, and sort of returning the land back. But so was it here? Was it real? Was it not? Was it a community that was left behind in this idea of an overlap? So in a sense, this nature of distorting the perception of time. And again, that idea of core, what is important. And so this sort of sets a place or a space or placemaking where something new or something else can re-emerge. So this idea again of this, what does it mean, when we talk about latent potential? This is a house for a writer, the same client who is now bought by somebody else, but that's separate. What's beautiful about it, it has this sort of grid of trees, a warp and weft, which already constructs a pilotis, sort of landscape that has these sort of columns and this incredible roof. And again, what might seem chaotic, in this arrangement of trees, that at some point this idea of drawing, which I can show you, and that's the working drawing model that we did, and you can see these sort of small spindly palm, the arecanut palm, that we used actually to delineate the space that we found on site. And so this whole idea of what does it mean to survey a ground? What does it mean to survey? Much like in this idea of a relationship, when you meet someone, it's impossible to know everything about them. Sometimes you do, but oftentimes it's returning back to that relationship that there are discoveries. So this whole nature of, how does one begin to survey a site in the same, idea of if we use a friend, a mother, a family, a girlfriend, husband, wife, this idea of site and the nature of site. And what does it mean to engage or to survey, and what is that idea of survey? What does one actually, exchange in that communication? So again, here, these are just different instruments of representation. And what one begins to discover is this sense of actually a structure, what might seem as chaos. There is actually a sense of structure in the way these things are arranged. There's a rhythm to the trees. They need the certain space between them. And what we did find eventually was, a dimension of 1.2 meters multiplied by 3, which is the dimension of a sheet of plywood. Again, this idea of industry. And that gave us the dimension of the building, which is 3.6 meters wide, and I think, if I'm correct, about 20-odd meters long, but that's actually a variable, if you want to call it that. And that dimension we found was an optimum dimension that was able to negotiate or engage the space that was actually found between the trees, a space that one could inhabit, a space that was optimum to build, et cetera, et cetera. And again, this was something that, the carpenters had never built before. And at first when I said that, we're going to do this thing, and they said, no way, we've never done that, and forget it. So I said, they were actually cabinet makers. So all I said was, just imagine you're making a cabinet that is 3.6 meters wide, 6 meters high and 20 meters long. And I said, yeah, that's easy, we can do that. So it's just that slight shift that suddenly changes the way you view something. But anyway, you can see sort of the diagram of this. It's not really this, what do you want to call it? The sort of slipping is actually because of the nature of the location of the trees, and the structure on the left is more, in a sense, suggesting a sort of gentle nudge, sort of drawing you into the building. There's no sense of a front door, and so there's no narrative of how you actually come into the project. So it's sort of a breakdown, a loss of structure, which I particularly like, much like Aalto, where at some point you begin to construct, and as you begin to get closer, and you're able to catch the structure, it actually is a sense, it's elusive, like a deer in the forest, where you can see the deer, and before you know it, it's gone. And then again it reemerges. So that idea of viewing, that idea of experience, that it's now here, not now here, now there. It's a sort of present, absent, both at the same time. Just models that we've made, staircase details. Often we actually use that one wooden model, which was really the one that was used to construct this entire project. What's interesting here is that after making these things right from the beginning, that the artisans who are involved, they actually, by the time they actually get onto site, they're so familiar, in the sequence, like music, if you want to call it. There's a rhythm, or there's an unfolding, and there's an intuitive sort of basis on which they're able to understand their proportions and their movement. And so we fundamentally would have a plan and a basic section, and really everything else then gets built from all these instruments that we make. Again, here the idea of porosity, because we have great weather for 8 months of the year. In the monsoons, of course, it's a pretty hard, rigorous monsoon, so the building gets protected during that time, but this idea of porosity. And what I discovered, again, with this idea of inside and outside, was I was fortunate to stay in one of the rooms, actually the one behind this kitchen platform, looking through, and it was a sort of moonlit day, and it was beautiful, actually, when I first discovered that the moonlight was actually reflected, or was reflecting, or resonating between the louvers, and slowly actually emanated in the sound of the sea. So when you are outside, the nature of sound that was felt outside and the nature of sound felt inside was identical. The atmospheric air that was outside, that was inside, was identical. And then this sense of moonlight. So actually I was in an enclosure, but everything about it proved otherwise. I completely felt that I was actually outside. And so again, this idea of senses, eyes, perception, and possibilities that are sort of, I think, inherent in what we do, and the possibility of trying to draw them out. I think that's somewhere, I think, for us really of great interest, this idea of a limitless sense of, the possibilities that what we do, we can express ourselves and find these kinds of situations. But anyway, this particular slide I like because it's something that I had imagined at the onset of the project, completely illogical, but this idea of lanterns, glowing in the dark in this particular space, and how we got to this. And it's quite interesting because on my own, I don't think it would be possible. Yes, to a certain degree it is, but it was this whole collective that came together in this idea of a vision, and a shared vision of, the possibilities that we can all encounter or experience collectively. This was sort of somewhere between architecture. I wouldn't call it quite art, but this was a project for the Victoria Albert Museum. The brief, it was a small, close competition, but more importantly, it was a place, for contemplation. It was a 1:1 project where architects built small, and it was set in the museum. It was set in the Victoria Albert Museum in London. And so it was a whole brief of, place of meditation, place for study, and we could do one of these, whatever, place for worship. And so our interest was actually this sort of vestige space that's actually left in the boundaries, between the boundaries of occupation and boundary. And this is actually behind one of our old studios that we shared in Bombay, these beautiful, actually quite interesting spaces that were formed in the sliver. And so our interest was to show that, the possibility, what might appear to be constricted, that all these conditions, that were written about could actually collectively exist and simultaneously exist. And so what we wanted to represent was this space. I mean, you can see it's like a railway bogies. There are sort of these houses that are set in this 2-meter gap, which is the setback between the boundary wall and the building, where, for 3 generations, people actually, the staff who worked in this warehouse actually lived and had made space for themselves. And how they self-regulated each other, this idea of, you can see there's a little shadow and a drop of about 50 mil, which was the public space, and that became the private space. So, but also this idea of, fire exits, etc., etc. Luis, we're okay on time? Yeah. So, again, importantly, what was interesting about this place was the sense of trees, I think this is a cultural condition that exists geographically around the world, where we would basically delineate boundaries by planting saplings or trees or branches, to delineate our sort of working space. And how over a period of time these trees then, go on to become trees. And then through a process of time, as development takes place, walls are built, and sometimes if a tree is lucky, depending on which side it falls, it escapes that wall. And so here really this tree in a sense was the core. It sort of, gave the foundation to this idea of inhabitation. Just the sort of working model proposal, and that's the model. I'm going to be quick. And what we had to do was actually present this in the plaster courts, during the Renaissance and these different periods of these, plaster courts, Santiago, Compostela, so of other cities, of other places. And our whole idea was to sort of present a sliver of Mumbai, in this other city, in this imaginary city. And again, this idea, very importantly, again, what's important in Mumbai, we have a population of 22 million people. If you look at the official spatial map of Mumbai, that is, the one that you would get from a library or from the official books, the spatial map that is registered there and the spatial map that one would actually, if one had to take a real section, would not actually match, because all these spaces that are open are actually filled in, and more than 50% of the population actually fills into these spaces. And again, more importantly, it's not so much to make a judgment, good, bad, right or wrong, but the potential that exists in this mutual relationship, and what are the possibilities of, reconsidering how do we look at space. So our idea here was this sense of camouflage, of discrete, because they do exist. They exist unauthorized or illegally, but, in fact, a lot of people who are supposed to be working or work in departments that are actually supposed to be tearing these buildings down actually live in them. So how do you deal with that problem? So it's an interesting sort of exercise or interesting situation. And here we wanted to present basically a sliver of Mumbai, this idea of fragility, which comes with the nature of plaster or plaster Paris. And also this idea of camouflage and the way that, the preciousness of history, in a sense, is not really there, in the sense that, yes, it considers, but it doesn't take it with the sort of seriousness, in a way that there's a status quo to it. So anyway, that's the sort of footprint of the project. And you see these sort of pockmarks, which are these, it's like bush hammered or chiseled concrete that, we cast concrete and then it's chiseled. And it's kind of showing Mumbai in construction. These are the sort of boundary walls, and then what's sort of inside is something completely different. And also just the nature of the proximity towards Michelangelo's David, et cetera, et cetera. But it was more, again, to create this sense of, tension, but I don't like that particular word, a sense of location or place, and its need to ground itself with sort of familiar things that one would find in a city. Again, here it's a very precise model, but a model at full scale, which more importantly depicts what our intention or endeavor here was to depict the actual experience. So the idea was to transport the experience of what we experienced in Mumbai and transfer that to the UK and wherever else it could go. But so much so that they're independent and autonomous, but yet also in some way connected to something that really exists. So this idea of bas relief, and that's the relief of Mumbai. If you do come to Mumbai, that's what you see everywhere all the time. What happened? This is a project under construction right now. It's an old warehouse in Mumbai. And these are sort of like 1, 2, 3, about, I think 7 units, 7 units, 8 units. And the whole idea of the adjacency, because there are these structures that you see on the left here on the adjacent side, and the original had actually an A-frame roof, so it was the amount of water that fell. You know, how do you displace or how do you collect that water? Because the space is only a 450 millimeter wall or an 18-inch wall that you have to actually collect all this water that's coming off the roof. And also, in a sense, is then a problem for the neighbors because, you know, it doesn't make sense, you know, so much so to, though one might physically have the land, they've occupied and they've been there for 40 years. So how does one consider these conditions? And so what we did here was actually drop the roof on the inside and in a sense make these openings, which you can call, you know, courtyards. They're kind of like the Hutong house, but the extension of the street, and that was the loading dock. So very quickly, I'm going to run through this just to give you a sense of something that we're interested in doing. And this idea of, you know, what is called equanimous, that is not based on east-west, north-south, or on even economy, that what we're interested in is a shared experience or shared quality, independent of location. So all the different structures vary in their size, vary in their location, and in a sense, our whole endeavor was there was no preference, so to speak, that, you know, no matter where you were, the experience was shared or similar. Of course, the nature of the light, the nature of, you know, the rain would differ, but what was felt inside was shared and similar. So that was really the basic of main endeavor here in developing this project. I'm going to be a little quick because there are 2 more projects, and I just want to run through this. Again, this idea of this, you know, South American flute, where it's the light and the air that fills the volume that gives it these different nuances. So as you walk back and forth through this alley or this sort of this connection or the spine, that you have a sense of the sense of sound through space. Again, we make these tape drawings. The carpenters discovered this incredible method, you know, from full-scale mock-ups. Now they start making these tape drawings where they use masking tape, and they do it on very inexpensive plywood, because where we are in the monsoon, it's impossible for paper to remain flat. It's so damp and humid that the paper doesn't last through the season. And so then I asked my, you know, Jivaram, the head guy, who sort of said that, yeah, this is a tree for birds to sit on. You know, and he kind of knew at some point. I said, you know, Jivaram, isn't this a bit expensive? I mean, plywood drawings. And he said, he kind of gives me a big smile. I knew you would ask me that question one day. And so then he sort of pulls out this paper and then works out that, you know, this is the cost of a printer, this is how much it costs to service it, and this is the cost of paper, ink, da-da-da-da-da. And he actually showed me that, you know, the cost of doing it this way was far more economical in terms of its immediacy, but also in the long term, because these are sort of, in a way, tablets. So this whole idea of reverse engineering also then becomes quite important in what we do or what we begin to look at. This is a slight shift. This is a project in China. We're doing 2 high-rise buildings, if I'm correct, 180 meters or 140 meters high. I'm not sure, but about 50 stories high. You know, sort of going from 0 to 100 in, you know, 5 seconds. And it's great because these are actually drawings done by my carpenter, this particular drawing. And we just, you know, just an imaginary drawing of how they, you know, it was a story and that's what they made. But more importantly, this idea of infrastructure, this idea of skin, you know, where really is the site of a tower, and this idea of the envelope. And, you know, for me, what's interesting is the idea of tattoo, that, you know, how does one negotiate a landscape? You know, if you think about your local culture, the Aborigines, you know, Maoris, or the South Americans, or anywhere really, that if you imagine or visualize yourself naked, physically naked, without any marks on your body, you know, how do you really negotiate the landscape? How do you claim your own space? So for me, this interest with the idea of tattoo, surface, envelope, and I'm just sort of making a reference to the nature of building, of, you know, locating yourself in space or place. So this image sort of references to that. Again, for us, the interest was on a high-rise project like this was more the sense of the facade, you know, not facade as in just its flatness, but a sense of its sense of depth. And the whole idea of developing the project was based on something which is also very local in China, but also local in where we are. But this idea that you always enter and exit the building on the edges. So the facade, so to speak, is a 9-meter setback of an airspace, or if you want to call it a veranda or patio that sort of runs the entire length of the building on two sides. And then the building is actually set back, or the glazing is set back from that. So in essence, every space, and again, this is a sort of very local building. I call these sort of running balconies, because you always enter the building through these balconies or these running balconies to each of the units, and you always exit out. So in a sense, it becomes a public space, a public street, which is set up on different levels. And the whole idea, again, was to simulate or sort of construct a very similar quality spatial experience, that there's always a movement on the outside. So there are two different sides. How did we negotiate this was this idea of infrastructure. One was that idea of formal and the informal, because much like in India, there's also a huge industry, local industry, that is entrepreneurship, and sort of tapping into the possibility of joining the two, where our interest was in this idea of adulteration, because we can't really control these projects in China. They have their own systems, they have their own place. So this idea of, how do you negotiate as architects? How do you negotiate this idea of program, or what is program, and what is then design, or what is the motivation of design? And so really our whole real interest was to develop a sort of frame that was a given, and then this idea of this enclosure. So whatever happened to the frame, what was sacred or what was core was this 9-meter setback space that was inherent and integrated into the building. And it could take any nuances, any variables, any distortions, and it had the ability for that kind of tolerance. So we were interested really in this idea of how do we construct projects like this which include the idea of tolerance into them. More than this idea of, this idea of precision, I think our interest was more the idea of a lack of precision. But anyway, I don't have the plans. It's a sort of a ground floor plan, but it's a very porous building. Again, this idea of a 9-meter setback, the glazing is set back, and things can open up. So your entire studio or your entire working space is one open air space, and they're all interlinked. I think maybe in the next plan, where there are these stairs that actually connect, like a snakes and ladders game, you can sort of see this. So you have all these different routes. It's a sort of non-linear narrative of depending on different ways to get to the same place. And we often do that living in cities, depending on the mood, depending on where you are, what vehicle you're driving, the time of the day, et cetera, that you have to, it's the problem of choice. I think another interesting question that I'm often asking myself, that as humans, we're plagued with the problem of choice. And I use the word plagued more importantly, because I think it's always there, the imminence of making a choice. And so this idea of how then does it get included in the architecture. And you can kind of vaguely see a silhouette of those stairs going through. But very fascinated with this idea of a tower and a snakes and ladders game, because if you look, we've all played snakes and ladders, I would think. And it has a sort of verticality to it, of going from down to up and then sliding back down. But anyway, the last project, this is a house that was completed last year. Here again, it's off the grid in a sense, where water has to be located on site. And this was the first cut that we had to make. A young 13-year-old water diviner sort of comes to site with the coconut and says, there's no way, this guy's going to find water. And, so everyone says, kind of looks at me and makes that nod of the head and kind of saying, you see, So this young kid, and, he carries this coconut and he keeps moving, and this coconut kind of keeps falling from his hand, just sort of tilts. And at some point, he kind of stands in one place and registers where this coconut just is very stationary. And then he tabulates, saying that, it's X amount of feet below the ground, 6,000 liters per hour, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I said, great, a circle is marked. And it was important that we do this right before the monsoon, because you only have a month and a half window, because that's when the water table is at its lowest. May, because we have the monsoons come, pretty much in the first or second half, the first part of the second half of June. So it's a month and a half of a window where you have to strike the ground, cut the ground, open the ground, and reach the lowest level of the water table. Again, importantly, it was this idea of balancing cut and fill. So here of course it's in the process of construction, but the entire dependency of the land is based on this particular source of water. And it's a month and a half that you have to put this sort of artesian well up. And sure enough, spot, the liters, he was, spot on. And I think it's like 9.5 times out of 10 he's been spot on, and we've used him quite often. So again, this where does one? It's not for me not so much mumbo jumbo, but it's this idea of intuition about sense and about faith. I think more importantly, or belief in that sense. I think which is really more the operative. I think endeavor that there has to be a sense of belief in something that quite can't be explained. But again, here this particular slide that shows the cut, the earlier slide shows the cut and the fill, because this particular piece of land, there were 2 paddy fields that were open, it was a beautiful old mango orchard, we kept the trees, and the idea was to use that cut that we had, and no more than 50 or 100, less than 100 meters, this mud was taken from there and actually hand carried and moved to the side. Again, interestingly enough, what we did was use the rains to compact the earth. So we weren't really standing there with, hose pipes and trucks coming in, to water to water the ground and to compact it. We allowed the monsoons to actually do their work, and the earth settled, just creating a high ground. So this slide just shows you that relationship. And you can see that's the opening. And I often like to liken this project more as the courtyard that, in a sense, negotiates the anxieties of the place, anxieties of the ground, because every monsoon, or pretty much every monsoon, this place floods. And so we had to create a high ground, and you can see that's the clearing. Also, what we did was sort of slide the house or slide the project in among the trees, because we were also using the trees because their foliage increases during the monsoon. There's a sort of thickness to the foliage, and in a sense sort of protects you from the wind and from the sort of lashing monsoon. And in a way, the gesture sort of turning your back to the rain without really, without actually sort of blocking it out. And this enabled us to actually construct a space that didn't really require sort of, sheets of glass and et cetera, something which is very fundamental, very basic in the way that one could actually inhabit. And here, these are all the different armatures, all the different instruments, meeting going on. That's a working drawing model, a full-scale mock-up. That's Jean-Marc from Pondicherry, who Anupama has worked with, the gentleman up there on the left. And so, we have these opportunities also of this idea of globalization or local, that he's actually a companion from France who happened to come to India, and there are these moments, these crossovers, these overlaps, and how that possibility also actually folds into the work. And this idea of, transferring knowledge from different parts of the world, and it can also be in context. And you can see the quality of drawings now, in a period of 5 years, of how that has changed or how much it's improved. And oftentimes you see that they won't give dimensions. It's just, the lack of a dimension, because what I found is that the moment you give a dimension or you make everything known, then it's merely seen as an instruction, and then an instruction is carried out. As opposed to that it's a loose framework where one has to cross-reference between drawing, model, photograph, I don't know, just any of these things. Because I think somewhere it's also important is how much you don't tell. Because if you tell everything, then you don't really need to engage. And then it's just a question of, a sort of a sense of a malaise in the way you would actually participate. I don't know, there's a very particular quality to that. So these drawings are really something that more express the nature of, you can see just different joints, and these are all done by the carpenters. And also this idea of striking, that they've practiced, and the moment they're doing it, that last moment, because it still remains open till that very point where they finally strike that last blow to make a closure on what's being built. So that's the space in between that I call the space to release the anxiety of the ground, because it kind of floods and it's cutting a donut in the slab and sort of releases the pressure, the tension of the water on the surface of the earth. And also a sense of an enclosure, because in the monsoon, you can hear the trees grow, and it can be quite, not claustrophobic, but quite intense as an experience. So there's a space that one can actually get into, and feel contained. So from all aspects of space making, place making, this idea of creating a sort of sacred space that remains, and that actually constitutes the nature of place. You can see the cross section. So that's the well, that's the high ground, and these sort of bumps and these sort of the topography is sort of left untouched. And I think last year it registered to the last step in the monsoon. So in a sense, the house also suggests this idea of a boat without it sort of alluding literally to it. But while you're seated inside, you have this landscape dropping away, or when you're sitting on a boat, the sense of perspective to the water. And of course, it's only a question of 4 hours because it's full moon, high tide, heavy rain, which disables, in fact, the flow of the water running out to the sea. So you kind of have to wait that point in time out. And what was nice, I intentionally put the pool below the water, and the pool sort of actually floods. So the only thing that remains is really the sort of core of the house that is kept above the high level watermark. So this was my client. The house was completed. I walked, I used to go visit her, and I said, "There's something's missing in the courtyard, and it needs to be something big." And I had a beautiful old tree that was cut. And I said, "No, but I can't give you the tree because everyone listening just said, no, we can't give the tree." And then she said, "My mom's doing some work up in, down in the south, and she's got these rocks. Can I just ask you to send one of them?" I said, "Sure." A month and a half later, she gets a panic phone call on a Monday morning. She said, "Bijoy, these rocks have arrived." So I said, "Okay, no problem. Just, drop them off." We couldn't do it with the crane. You're probably asking, why didn't they just take the crane and put it over the house? Never do it in India. Never. If they say yes, 100%, yes, 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 remember there's that maybe, no, that exists. Right? So we have to take it through the front door and then take the crane to just position it. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bijoy. Really beautiful work and very poetic description of the context. I think we don't have time for questions, or do we? No? Well, sorry we don't have time, but it was good that we heard the whole story. No, it was a very, very nice story, and I think the storytelling aspect you brought from India is, it's quite interesting to present architecture through these stories. I think it was quite rich. Okay, please join me in thanking Bijoy.